In the early 1980s, Western Europe had a problem. Its air forces were looking toward the next generation of combat aircraft. Development costs were climbing, and several countries were asking the same basic question: why build separate fighters when Europe could share the cost of building one? On paper, cooperation made obvious sense. Britain, France, West Germany, Italy, and Spain all had reasons to want a new aircraft. They had strong aerospace industries. They were allies, and all of them understood that designing a modern fighter was becoming far too expensive to treat as just another national project. For a moment, it looked as though Europe might actually build one future fighter together. But there was a problem hidden inside that simple idea. The countries agreed that they needed a new airplane before they agreed on what that airplane actually needed to be. And that difference would eventually help produce not one European fighter, but two. To understand why France went its own way with the Rafale, you have to go back to 1983, when discussions were taking shape around what was then called the future European fighter aircraft. France was not standing outside the project. It was part of the conversation. That matters, because the story is sometimes told as though France simply rejected European cooperation from the beginning. It didn't. The harder truth was that cooperation became increasingly difficult once broad political agreement had to be translated into an actual aircraft. A fighter is a collection of compromises. Weight affects range, range affects fuel, fuel affects size, mission requirements affect sensors, structure, weapons integration, and cost. Even countries that agree on the threat can disagree about which compromises matter most. British parliamentary records from the period describe one of those disagreements very clearly. France wanted a lighter aircraft than its partners did. France also placed comparable importance on air-to-air and air-to-surface missions, while the other participants placed greater emphasis on the air-to-air role. That may sound like a technical disagreement. It wasn't only technical. Different requirements were pointing toward different airplanes. And then there was the French Navy. France was not only trying to replace aircraft for its air force, it also needed a future fighter that could serve aboard its aircraft carrier. Carrier aviation brings requirements that a land-based air force does not have to solve in exactly the same way. France therefore had a strong incentive to make sure that whatever aircraft emerged from the process could fit its own naval as well as air force needs. Suddenly, the question was no longer simply whether 5 countries could divide the cost of a fighter. It was whether they could agree on a single fighter that satisfied all of them without forcing one country to accept an aircraft that did not really fit what it needed. And this is where the timeline becomes especially interesting. France did not wait until the European effort had collapsed before thinking about another path. While the multinational discussions were still underway, France was already developing the technological foundation for what would become the Rafale. A French experimental combat aircraft effort was taking shape in the first half of the 1980s, eventually producing the Rafale A demonstrator. In other words, France was participating in European negotiations while preserving a national alternative. That does not mean the European effort was fake. It means France understood that the negotiations might not produce the aircraft it wanted. By 1984 and 1985, the feasibility work was forcing those differences into the open. The requirements could not simply be averaged together and still satisfy everyone. There were differences in weight, mission priorities, and the overall concept of the aircraft. There were also industrial and political questions surrounding any multinational program of this size, because a shared fighter is never only an engineering project. It determines where work is performed, which companies retain critical expertise, and how much control each government has over future development. Those issues mattered, but they should not be reduced to a simple story in which one side was right and the other was wrong. The countries were trying to solve similar problems with different priorities. In August 1985, France withdrew from the common program. The remaining European partners continued down the path that would eventually produce the Eurofighter Typhoon. France committed to its own path, and at that moment France gained something valuable: more control over its own requirements. But it also inherited something much less comfortable: the risk. Sharing a fighter program means sharing disagreements, delays, and compromises. It also means sharing part of the financial and industrial burden. Going national gave France greater freedom to shape its aircraft around French requirements, But France would also have to make that choice work over many years of development. This is the part of the story that is easy to lose when we look backward from a successful aircraft already sitting on a flight line. We know the Rafale exists. Engineers in 1985 did not know what the program would look like 20 years later. Governments could change. Budgets could tighten. Requirements could evolve. Technologies could fail to mature as expected. An aircraft demonstrator might fly and still never become a successful operational fighter. France had chosen a direction. It had not yet proven that direction would work. Then came July 1986. Less than a year after France left the European effort, the Rafale A technology demonstrator made its first flight. Visually, it was the first clear sign that the French alternative was no longer just a plan sitting inside ministries and engineering offices. There was now an airplane in the sky. But that first flight can also create the wrong impression. A demonstrator is not an operational combat aircraft. The Rafale program still had a long road ahead. The formal program moved forward in the late 1980s. Development aircraft followed. The production versions would have to satisfy both the French Air Force and the French Navy. Systems would evolve, budgets would be debated, and years would pass before Rafale became part of everyday French military operations. That long timeline tells us something important about major defense programs. Walking away from a partnership can happen relatively quickly. Building a replacement for that partnership can take a generation. And France had given Rafale an unusually large job. The goal was not simply to replace one aging fighter with another. France wanted one aircraft family capable of taking over missions that had previously been distributed among 7 different types of combat aircraft in the French Air Force and Navy. That helps explain why versatility was built so deeply into the Rafale concept. France was trying to reduce a complicated collection of specialized aircraft into a smaller number of highly adaptable ones. For the French military, that potentially meant fewer separate aircraft families to operate, support, modernize, and train around. But it also increased the importance of getting the new aircraft right. If one design was supposed to absorb the work of several older types, it had to satisfy a remarkably broad set of institutional demands. The naval version made the challenge even more visible. France wanted the same basic aircraft family to operate both from land bases and from an aircraft carrier. That requirement was not an afterthought added decades later. It reflected the French military problem that had existed near the beginning of the program. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Europe, the other path was taking shape. Britain, Germany, Italy, and Spain continued the multinational project that evolved into Eurofighter. And this is where comparisons between Rafale and Typhoon often become less useful than the history behind them. It is tempting to turn the two aircraft into a contest. Which one is better? Which one would win? Which country made the smarter decision? Those questions are easy to package. They are much harder to answer honestly, because they ignore why the programs diverged in the first place. Rafale and Eurofighter emerged from different requirements, different institutional arrangements, and different compromises. The more revealing comparison is not between two airplanes fighting each other. It is between two ways of organizing a major European combat aircraft program. Eurofighter spread development and production across several nations. That preserved industrial participation across multiple countries and distributed the burden. But multinational management also meant that major decisions had to accommodate several governments and several aerospace industries. Rafale concentrated the program much more heavily inside France. That gave France greater national control over requirements and future evolution, but it also placed more of the responsibility for sustaining the program on France itself. Neither model magically removes cost, risk, politics, or delay. They simply distribute those problems differently. And Rafale's development shows just how long the consequences of the 1985 decision lasted. The Rafale A flew in 1986, yet the operational story unfolded over many more years. Rafale entered service first with the French Navy in the 2000s, and then with the French Air Force. By then, the strategic world in which the airplane had originally been conceived had already changed dramatically. The Cold War had ended. Germany had reunified. European security assumptions had shifted. Military budgets had faced new pressures. Yet both Rafale and Eurofighter survived that transformation. That alone tells us something about the original European fighter debate. The disagreement did not produce one successful program and one failed program. It produced two aircraft families that continued to evolve long after the political environment that created them had disappeared. For France, Rafale eventually became much more than an answer to a requirement written in the 1980s. It became central to French combat aviation, operating from both land and sea, and progressively taking over the missions once performed by those different older aircraft types. France also retained a domestic industrial base capable of developing and upgrading a frontline combat aircraft. French officials and Dassault have long connected that ability with the broader idea of strategic and technological sovereignty. That does not mean France became independent of every foreign supplier or every international partnership. Modern aerospace does not work that simply. But it did mean that France retained an unusually high degree of national authority over the development path of its principal fighter. And now the strange decision from the beginning starts to make more sense. In 1985, France was not choosing between cooperation and isolation in some abstract political argument. It was deciding how much compromise it was prepared to accept in the aircraft that would eventually sit at the center of French combat aviation. Cooperation offered real advantages. So did greater national control. The problem was that France and its partners were no longer asking for exactly the same machine. And once their requirements had moved far enough apart, staying together could itself have become a compromise too large to ignore. So did France make the right decision? Looking at Rafale today makes it tempting to simply say yes. But history deserves a more careful answer. The decision brought France greater control over the design and evolution of its fighter. It also brought years of development risk, financial pressure, and responsibility that could not simply be handed to multinational partners. Eurofighter followed a different path and survived as well. Both aircraft became important parts of European air power. The real lesson is therefore not that France proved its neighbors wrong. It is that allies can face the same strategic environment and still reach different conclusions about what they need to build. Europe began the 1980s trying to move toward one future fighter. Instead, the process exposed just how different national military requirements could remain, even among close partners. France chose the national path. Britain, Germany, Italy, and Spain chose the multinational one. And from that disagreement came two of Europe's most important modern combat aircraft programs. So here's the bigger question. Did France make the right choice by accepting more cost and risk in exchange for greater control over its own fighter program? Or was Europe's multinational approach the smarter long-term model? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you enjoy fact-based stories about the decisions, technology, and history behind the world's most important military systems, subscribe to Defense TV. Because sometimes the most interesting part of a weapon isn't what it can do, it's why a country decided it needed to exist in the first place.